Welcome back to Unapologetic Living. I am Elizabeth, the hostess, and I am excited to have Monique Attinger on the show today. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's great to be here. I always love to get a chance to talk about oxalate and all good things.
Well, I am still learning, so I'm excited to have you because it's been a journey the last couple of years for myself, and I know I'm definitely not perfect with, and maybe still I'm consuming too many oxalates. But I do know that it's been definitely helpful these past couple of years to just at least become aware.
Yeah. Yeah. Because then you can make choices, right? I mean, I don't think there's a perfect diet. If somebody announces one and I get to live forever, I'll be right on board. But at the moment, it's like the best choices and the ones that are going to move your, health needle forward, so to speak. But yeah, it's not necessarily about zero oxalate. Some people do that, but that's not the only way to get there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I found you when, and I'm sure the phone heard me too, talking about low oxalate diets, right? You're low ox coach on Instagram. You're a
Yep.
holistic nutritionist.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and so talk to me a little bit about your story because I know, my journey has been okay. I was stopped with the meat. And then I'm like, oh, I'll be vegan in my high school years for like 9 months. And then I was like, okay, that's not working. And then not that it wasn't working. I'm like, oh, I missed some things. And then I was vegetarian for a really long time. Then I brought back in salmon and then it was bison and then I was doing a bunch of juicing, kale, beet greens. And I think in 2021, literally juiced, maybe not. I'm sure there were already some things brewing, right? But my poor significant other to kidney stones, like, right, with all of these oxalates,
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
and he was so inflamed that they couldn't even deal with the kidney stones. And
Oh,
so,
that sounds nasty. Yeah.
yeah, then the stint. And then 3 weeks later, after things relaxed, they went in and broke up the kidney stones. But, who's to say? But he'd never juiced in his life, right? And there were other things, he loved the monster drinks, so that wasn't necessarily a great thing either.
No.
But it really started to make me think, and he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So we had a lot of things going on, and he's like, let's try carnivore. And so that's kind of where we started in October 2022, was just like a little bit of just meat and fruit, no dairy. And then we went to just meat for like 3 weeks. And then that was very hard. And I definitely think we were experiencing some oxalate dumping. We were so sick, pain,
Probably. Yep.
body aches. I mean, we weren't going to the bathroom anyway. So I can't wait to hear your story.
Well, I'll just say the whole business with oxalate, especially if most of the oxalate in your body is oxalate that you've taken in via your diet, the gut can really have taken a beating up. And it does seem that a lot of us will have constipation, diarrhea, or will alternate between those two because the gut's essentially inflamed. And it can be lots of factors that contribute to that. Like it seems like everybody's getting a leaky gut diagnosis nowadays. Like there's stuff where it just seems like we have epidemic levels of it. But the combination of like really processed foods, um, lots of gluten in our diet, which the research is coming down harder and harder on that being a contributor to leaky gut. And then you have this pro-inflammatory thing called oxalate, and then it's beating up on your gut. It's not a surprise to me that the gut's going to be one of the places where people have issues. And it was certainly that for me. So if I kind of go back over my own story, looking in the rearview mirror, I'm pretty sure I started to have issues with oxalate when I was very young. Um, I ended up being one of those kids who has to have their tonsils and adenoids out. And interestingly enough, the tonsils are one of the places where oxalate can kind of accumulate. So I'd been eating, the North American pretty standard potatoes every day, if not multiple times a day, gluten bread, higher oxalate foods. And I ended up having my tonsils and adenoids out at about age 5. There's new research which says if you combine things like antibiotics with oxalate, you get an even amplified effect from the oxalate. So that would have been the first time I had antibiotics many times and then oxalate in my diet. By age 8, I was having problems digesting my food. And periodically, I would feel unwell, feel kind of nauseous, feel like my food just wasn't moving out of my stomach. Then, around the same time, I was having more and more difficulties with constipation, even though I was very young. By age 12, a doctor told me I had a lazy stomach. I do not know what this is, but that was this doctor's opinion on what was going on for me. And then by age 20, I had my gallbladder out. In hindsight, turns out gallstones can be oxalate based as well. So I was just slowly over time accumulating more and more oxalate. So I was in my 20s when I first decided to start to modify my diet because I just didn't feel as well as I thought I should feel. I watched other 20-year-olds, they seemed to be doing things I wasn't doing. And in order to do better with diet, the conventional advice for many decades has been more plants, more greens. So I tried to become a vegetarian. The first time I tried to do that, it was about 4 weeks and I was not sleeping well. My digestion was even worse. And I went, okay, this isn't working. But I still tried to continue with these really high oxalate, as we now call them, superfoods, right? Spinach, beets, chard. Um, you've got these gluten-free grains, which were just starting to hit the market in the 90s and early 2000s that I was trying to use because I'd gone gluten-free by then. So things like teff are eye-wateringly high, quinoa is pretty bad, buckwheat's pretty bad, especially if you're eating them as constants. And I was having nuts as snacks, and nuts are extremely high oxalate. Fast forward a little bit, I got married in my later 30s. I got pregnant with my first child at 40. And so I went, okay, I want to be really healthy because I'm a later in life mom. I'm really going to up my game. Oh my gosh. In hindsight, I was probably taking in maybe even a couple of 1,000 milligrams of oxalate some days because I was ticking all those boxes. I was I was eating spinach, beet greens, or chard every day, one of those 3. I was eating almonds every day. I was noticing that I wasn't tolerating dairy as well, which is something that happens to a lot of us. So I had substituted with almond milk and these other non-dairy milks. So I really was trying to do everything right and just getting sicker. So I managed to have my son. I had a number of miscarriages between my son and my daughter. Many people would assume that's age, but I would argue that the research out of the veterinary world, where they're looking at animal husbandry, has made it clear that if you have even ruminant animals and what they're grazing on is too high in oxalate, suddenly you have more pregnancy loss. And I was still eating really high oxalate. Oh, we'd added dark chocolate and doing all these things that were really, really high. Anyway, I managed to get pregnant with my daughter at 45. And then when she was about 2.5, I was feeling so sick. I thought, I am needing to do something about my health. And just about this time, we were weaning her because I'd done extended breastfeeding, and she was developing these terrible rashes. They look like chemical burns. They were awful. And I thought, I don't really want her at this young age to have to use something like a steroid cream. Let's see what our trusted naturopath has up his sleeve. And I explained to him what's happening. I'm explaining it doesn't seem to respond to zinc cream. It doesn't seem to be related to toilet training because some of the rash was on the back of her buttocks. But it's not my first rodeo, I should say. It's my second child. So I don't know what's going on here. And she seems to have sometimes reactions to certain foods. And then he says to me the fated words, "I think she's got an oxalate problem." To which I said, "What's an oxalate?" Because I was actually a bit of a nutrition buff. I'd always been a bit interested in nutrition because I was trying to improve my own health all the time because I just always felt like I didn't have the right amount of energy and I didn't have resilience. And then over time, thyroid issues, digestion issues, sleep issues, muscle pain. Like I was just ticking boxes for things, right? And and then I went down the oxalate rabbit hole. And essentially it changed my life. It was the first way of changing my diet where all the health markers started to improve. My thyroid started getting better. My digestion got better almost immediately. Muscle pain started to improve. Some of the other things took more time, but insomnia is a nasty one. That takes a while before your nervous system can calm down after all this oxalate in there. But it changed my life so much. I went from 48 when we discovered this problem with my daughter, and I started modeling the diet for her because I knew she wouldn't eat differently than everybody else at the table. And I started getting better across all these factors, but still feeling pretty sick. And then by the time I got to 53, so 5 years later, I took up karate and I'd never done a martial art in my life. So that's a big difference. 48, you think you're not going to live to see your kids grow up because that's how bad my health was. I really thought I've done these kids a disservice. I've passed on crappy genes because I thought it was my fault that my health was so bad. I'm just not functional and they're not getting me as the kind of mom that I wanted to be. There was all this stuff going on. To 53 when my husband said, we should do karate together as a family. And I said, great, let's do that. And all of us went and did karate together. And anybody who's done martial arts will attest to the fact that if the warm up doesn't kill you, you're doing well. And so I'll never forget the day then early in this whole process where we did 400 jumping jacks. And I got to the end and I went, how the heck did I just do that? Because I had had no capacity before then. So it was without question a game changer to reduce oxalate. But what happened between 48 and 53 is really important. So we can talk some more about that. But for me, the level of health I have now, and I'm in my 60s, is probably better than anything I've had since my 20s. And I'm suspicious that I've still got room to advance. That, the level of health I had in my 20s was already somewhat compromised. And I don't know what an uncompromised 60-year-old who's working out and doing all this stuff might be able to do. So, yeah, it changed my life so much. I changed my career. So I had started out in the IT world. I was an IT project manager, had a master's degree in library and information science, which turns out to be really handy if you want to understand research. And went back and trained as a nutritionist, and here I am.
Yeah, I find that it's usually something, right? And then, which oftentimes, for women, leads to a career change, right? At least several of the women that I've spoken to since I started my show, there's usually, right, that there's something that happens. They feel really crappy. They've hit a bottom or a low, and they find such relief in a new way of living, whatever that is, that
Well, the thing
sometimes
here
they
is
change
that
your
it for me, it was so profound that the same naturopath who had treated me since before my daughter was ever born, had never identified me as somebody with an oxalate problem. He
So
identified her, and then I went on the diet to support her, and then suddenly I'm getting better. So all I could think of was how many people out there are trying to do the right thing, are trying to get healthier, and there's an oxalate problem and nobody's identifying them, right?
so now,
That
and when you think about an oxalate problem, and this word really is new for me in the last 3 years.
right.
Uh, and a naturopath is the one that pointed it out to you.
Yeah.
You're definitely not hearing about it in most allopathic.
For sure not, unless you have kidney stones. Then if you're in the allopathic world, you will have heard about it, but they're not gonna identify any other kind of inflammatory issue, gut issue, all these other things where oxalate can be at play. There's no recognition of it there. Like, we don't test for it, we don't look for it, so we don't find it.
So I guess that was gonna be my next question. Is it for those who are really, like, bound and determined to go the allopathic route, or, get some sort of confirmation with a lab or a number, do they offer any sort of tests that, assess the level of oxalates in the body overall?
Not really. So the only test I know of which might do that for you, and it is like all most tests, which are snapshots of your
Yeah,
current situation, would be an organic acids test.
okay.
But if in the moment when you do the test, your kidneys are not moving a lot of oxalate out, you might not throw a definitive test, right? So you could throw a test where it looks like your oxalate's in range and it's no big deal. And then your allopathic doctor is going to go, well, you might have suspected this, but it's not your thing, right? And they could be absolutely wrong. But the other test I did manage to get from an allopathic doctor, and I will preamble that with the fact that I knew this man from before he was a doctor. So we have a long-term, friendship through a group of people in the background. So I could have a conversation with him that maybe some people couldn't have with their doctors. So I went in there and I said, let's perform an experiment. I said, I'm pretty sure that I've got issues with oxalate, even though I've never thrown a kidney stone in my life. And I'd really like to get a 24-hour urine test that tests for the amount of oxalate that you're excreting in a day. And he said, all right, I'll do that for you. So he did. He requested this 24-hour urine assay, and you quite literally have to collect all your urine for 24 hours. You send it off to the lab, and they get you back a number. Okay. The Mayo Clinic some years ago had a page on their website, which I wish I had screenshotted, but I did not, which said that at 45 milligrams of oxalate in a daily urine, you could be considered to have hyperoxaluria, that at levels that at, at like that, people could have kidney stones. So the number I got back from my 24-hour test was 293.
Mm.
So just to put it in context, but at the same time, even my doctor was a little confused. I don't know if he hadn't had a kidney stone patient in a while, but he said they list the normal range up to 300 milligrams. But he said at 293, I know that that's high oxalate in your urine. So I'm surprised they call it normal. So I think that we've got a couple of problems going on. One, people's diets have been getting so high, numbers like that look normal. And we don't know what the ideal, preferable, desirable level of oxalate in your urine per day should be. What we're doing instead is saying, okay, the average is looking like this, so we're going to call this a normal level. So for people who would be interested in trying to get one of these, I would just want them to have that as context. And as additional context, I did a second test, And both these tests were done when I thought I was mobilizing oxalate. So I'd had an uptick in symptoms, I was feeling a bit off, and so I wanted to find out how much oxalate was in my urine at that time. And the second time I did it, it was 101 or something like that milligrams. And my doctor said, "Oh, you're fine." And I thought, that's a far cry from what the Mayo Clinic used to say about what hyperoxaluria is. So we we don't we don't recognize we haven't I'm gonna say this differently. We have not developed what I would call good quality diagnostic, criteria. So if somebody's throwing out more than 100 milligrams of oxalate in their urine, somebody should be paying attention because I think we're ignoring the fact that our diet's going up. And part of that could be that all the conventional nutritional information is increase your quote unquote superfoods, eat more nuts for protein, you need dark leafy greens every day. Your gluten-free alternatives are really good for you. Like, in fact, when you trade gluten, unfortunately, for things like buckwheat or quinoa, you're actually upping your oxalate level. So there's so many things that we're telling people, oh, reduce your meat, reduce your dairy, so nutrient dense animal foods are also being excluded. So you really have less nutrients per bite in a plant, but you also have this toxic oxalate on board. And then we're saying, don't do these other things. So I think we have a perfect storm of things that are influencing how we eat and what we eat, which are not working in terms of making sure that we're healthier.
Yeah, I know that, I mean, just so many things to me that have been labeled, normal
Mm.
are really just common, and they don't have to be normal, right? They've normalized.
Common, that's a great way to put it. They're common. That
Yeah,
doesn't mean they're normal in the sense of what's healthy for us,
yeah,
right?
or even these labs, what they see, these I mean, even, as you go into perimenopause, right, some of these common symptoms of perimenopause or PMS, that's all has been normalized,
Yeah.
when in reality, I don't think so.
Well,
I
and interesting you should say that actually, because I've read some research which shows that hormones can affect how oxalate gets trafficked.
mm,
And most of my female clients will report that as they come into their menstrual cycle, they're seeing oxalate dumping, kind of a mini dump. And
mm.
it corresponds very closely to that PMS time period. So has PMS been normalized because we've actually been eating too much oxalate? And so everybody's kind of having some of this problem? I'm a little suspicious because I see also that clients who tend to find me maybe in that later perimenopause, early menopause time period when estrogen drops, and it turns out estrogen is protective against some of the effects of oxalate. So that's when we start to pick it up more carefully. So there's so many things here where perhaps again this kind of perfect storm idea of why we're hitting this when we're hitting this, why is it becoming most obvious to us, and what kinds of symptoms we end up having, which often are urinary because the kidneys do so much, but also other areas where cell transporters can be moving oxalate into those tissues and then they're being influenced by hormones and then stuff happens.
So, I know when when sometimes when you start to add new things or remove things, you can almost have sort of a detox, right? Things can get a little bit worse before
Oh
they get
yeah,
better, and you have to be
definitely.
ready, right, to, tackle that, have the mindset for feeling kinda crummy.
Yeah, or have some tools. I think of it as a toolkit. When I deal with clients, I often talk to them about The beginning while we work together, it's about building your toolkit so that you can respond to symptoms, which may be generated by oxalate, in a way that allows you to moderate those symptoms, make them more manageable, right? Because that's kind of the deal here. We've got this highly inflammatory, actively poisonous at a high enough level toxin, right? Where it's doing things to us. And so build a toolkit to respond to the kinds of things it does. So that might be a good segue into like what are kind of the main things that oxalate does to us in our bodies. And one of the first ones is depletes minerals. So I'm a little suspicious about the, again, epidemic levels of osteoporosis that we have because oxalate's a mineral chelator. So if you don't have enough minerals to be able to strengthen those bones, that's a big deal. But you also don't have enough minerals as cofactors to common processes in your tissues, or you don't have enough minerals so that you're starting to get restless leg, or you're starting to get muscle cramping, or you're starting to get other kinds of things like that. Or your energy levels are low because you don't have enough electrolytes. So electrolytes are just a special category of minerals. So we really have to think about the fact that oxalate's a mineral chelator, and one of the things it's doing is depleting us of minerals. That's how you end up with kidney stones out the other end because oxalate's bound to calcium, but it can bind to magnesium, it can bind to sodium and potassium, it can be pulling all kinds of things out of your system. Essentially, once it binds with those things, it becomes a compound, and then the kidneys are going to sweep the whole thing out of your system, not just the oxalate, and separate that from the mineral. So I think that's one of job one category of response, if you will. If I think oxalate's in play, I start to get more minerals in my diet by food, by supplements, by whatever. The other thing, though, is that oxalate is pro-inflammatory. And so if you're seeing chronic inflammation, you don't want to add something to your system that's pro-inflammatory. So we want to encourage a reduction of inflammation in the body. And that can be, again, by a multitude of things. So it could be anti-inflammatory supplements. It could be like a more ketogenic way of eating because ketones are actually things that will reduce inflammation as well. So you'd be looking for tools that help to reduce the inflammatory impact. And then the third thing, which I think is a big ticket item, is that oxalate disrupts the function of the mitochondria. So your energy levels right down at the tissue are being impacted. So that means that if your tissues don't have enough energy to do the work that they need to do, yes, you may feel fatigued, but it's not necessarily low adrenals. Like lots of people will say, oh, I've just got low adrenals. They haven't done any testing, they're just assuming. But what if it's actually oxalate, which is sort of reducing your body's capacity to make the energy in the first place and disrupting those mitochondria from the work that they need to do. So anything that's mitochondrial support is sort of my third leg of what your toolkit is built on. And that then allows us to respond to what can happen, which is oxalate stored in the tissues. And as it leaves the body, it gets, as the expression goes, one more kick at the can. So we want to have the right kinds of nutrients available to the body so it can do the work it needs to do that oxalate is triggering for it, and which we can't see. It's under the hood, right? So I always thought I had a lemon for a body because my body didn't seem to do what it needed to do. And I thought that had something to do with my genetics. I never considered the fact that the diet that everybody I see eating was the fundamental issue. And then once I got my diet right, my body was more than capable of doing the work that it needed to do. I just needed to get it what was required.
So it sounds as though uh, an elimination diet. 'Cause, 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 ' you kind of took it into your own hands. I mean, maybe with inspiration from the naturopath,
Yeah.
but that was how you came to truly, I don't know, believe that it was an oxalate problem. Like I would imagine as you start to see results, gosh, this really must be what it was.
Honestly, that was what sold me. Okay. So I've got a master's degree in library and information science. So part of what you do in your master's degree is learn stats and analytical things. And I knew about how to access information. So I could read the research. I could do all kinds of in-depth sort of exploration. But what sold me was I started to remove oxalate from my diet. And then I saw the needle move on all the kinds of things that were affecting me all at once. Now, not all of it was good because we've talked about oxalate can be doing things to you as it's leaving the body. One more kick at the can. But if the only lever I pulled was oxalate, then it had to be what was causing the changes. And I saw a combination of I slept worse, but I digested better. And I went, I've had to take handfuls of digestive enzymes for my life. And all of a sudden, I'm not having to take them at all. And I went, holy moly, that's huge, right? I was told after I lost my gallbladder, I'd never really digest food well. And here I am eating meals and not having to take digestive enzymes. And I went, okay, that's big. And yes, I did see some things get worse, but what I realized was that if all I did was pull this oxalate lever, then all this has to be related somehow. And I would never recommend to people to do it the way I did it. So it's 16 years ago that I started this. So I would have been, yeah, it was just just before I turned 48. So I'm just in the next few months going to turn 64. So it's been a while ago now. But I dropped oxalate as fast as I could drop oxalate. That just about guarantees that oxalate's going to move out of the storage locations quickly. Why? You no longer have oxalate coming in to sort of exert pressure against the tissue so that they're not pushing it out, right? If you reduce the concentration of it in the bloodstream, the tissues are going to get the idea, okay, I can get rid of some of this stuff. And if you're providing more nutrients, then those cell transporters that can be moving oxalate into the cells, they'll be getting the nutrients they want instead and more likely to be pushing oxalate out of the cells. So you can get a lot of movement in response to reducing quickly. I would not recommend that. I did end up in the ER more than once. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So you want it, like ideally, you want to reduce it slowly and bring up nutrients that are going to allow your body to do the work it has to do at the same time. So I'm bringing oxalate down, I'm bringing nutrients up so that I'm ready to be able to respond. I've learned something about what nutrients work best for me before I'm really starting to mobilize this stuff. Particularly if you've had a really high oxalate diet, you want to do it that way. So as somebody who did it the hard way, I still could see that it was making a difference. That even if I had insomnia, that I was feeling better and had better energy during the day, that I was digesting my food better, that there were good things happening. And I learned a lot of the tricks of the trade sort of the hard way over time. And so I can be helpful for people who are trying to come down this journey in terms of what do you do to not have it be so hard on you. And like the biggest thing is really reduce slowly, bring your nutrients up so that your body's kind of ready to handle once you get the oxalate low enough, it's got enough nutrition on board that it can handle it better. It's you still may have symptoms, but it doesn't have to be you bounce into ER.
Right, right. And um I know that, yeah, I mean, we were feeling pretty bad when we were just doing just meat. It was rough.
Yeah.
Um, like bad, like aching bad, not good. And that's when we added some blueberries back. We were just really struggling. And I don't know if that was the move either, but right, because you hear people like Jordan Peterson and Michaela Peterson who've been on this strictly carnivore diet, right, and have reversed autoimmune conditions.
But
Um,
I think we can give ourselves some time to get there. Like, I've heard Michaela and Jordan Peterson's stories, and I sort of wonder if they were at the highest end of oxalate. So it I think it might depend not just how compromised you are. Obviously, they had significant health issues, particularly Michaela. Um, and there may be differences in terms of genetics that impact oxalate as well, because you can have different genetics in terms of these cell transporters that move oxalate. And so it may be some of us are more likely to traffic it into cells. Maybe some of us are having a harder time getting rid of it because it's governed by secretion. There could be all kinds of things going on there. Um, and I do think in the long run, you can get to carnivore. I'm pretty close to 100% carnivore now, although I'm happily drinking a coffee at this moment, which is not carnivore, but
I was gonna ask
so I
if you drink coffee and, uh, yeah, that was one question I was curious about because I love it's like the one thing I'm not ready to give up.
well, and honestly, if I wasn't getting the health that I wanted, like Jordan and Michaela Peterson make it very clear, they can't mess around with this diet. As soon
Right.
as they do, they end up compromising their results. If this was the difference between I feel really good or I don't, this would be abandoned. But for me, I'm not that susceptible. But what I do find is that I have dealt with people where they went carnivore, they stayed carnivore, but it's almost like there's a part of the oxalate healing where you might actually need to slow things down by causing your body to have to handle plants. Like there's some kind of adaptation thing, which I think some people get caught on with carnivore. And let me be really clear, I think when people start talking about adaptation with carnivore, they're probably talking about oxalate dumping, at least in part. So you do have a metabolic switch you have to make, which is really about insulin and leptin and metabolic management, I'll say. But there is this other piece where perhaps you need some fuel, straight ahead fuel that the cells can get access to easily because they're just trying to do work, right? So I've had carnivore clients where I had to take them back to incorporating some carbs into their diet because their bodies were really struggling without it. Now, will they eventually be able to go back to full carnivore? Yeah, I don't think that that's impossible, but I do think we have to think about oxalate in a whole different way than we think about other toxins. We do not flush this thing out fast, and we maybe should be thankful for that. Because I don't know what the implications would be if every molecule of oxalate decided to move all at the same time, especially when you're talking about things like bones, which can be places where oxalate's stored. But what little research we have so far comes from the hyperoxaluria world, and that says that we lose oxalate over months and years, not like this. So there's this real need to be able to, I'm going to say, we need to treat it like a slow process. It's gonna be a marathon, not a sprint, and it makes me think about that slow food movement. I don't know what I would slow oxalate movement, I don't know, well, I'll have to come up with a tagline, but I think that's a really important piece of this, is that maybe we're gonna get to the finish line, but maybe this sucker is the kind of race where the tortoise wins, not the hare.
Right. So when you say you're just about 100% carnivore, just meat, are you eating any raw dairy or raw cheeses, or are you just eating flesh and like meat stocks and bone broth, things like that?
Well, my diet looks kind of like this. So I have my coffee, so that's not completely compliant, but I don't eat dairy. I still want to do an experiment with raw dairy, but dairy seems to be not my friend. So I'm not doing any dairy products. I eat eggs, chicken, pork, beef, like if it's an animal product. Otherwise, I don't worry about it. Um, and I do tend to eat still a fair amount of chicken, so I know in the carnivore world this is like bad somehow, but I get organic free range chickens and I eat them and I like it. So I continue to do that. And I will maybe every week or two when my family's over and I have my kids who are 23 and 18 now, and we have their respective one's got a fiance, one's got a boyfriend, and we have everybody around the table. We might have berries with supper, and I might have some of those. And I usually will make them with like something like allulose, which is really good for metabolic health, which makes them a little sweeter, makes a little juice, and I'm going to enjoy that and I will be fine.
Mhm.
But, otherwise, day to day, meat, eggs, fish. I don't do bone broth. I know that that's big in the carnivore world, but it's higher in histamine. And there's some indication that if you get things like collagen outside of a whole food product, so collagen's in meat, obviously, but if you get this concentrated collagen dose, that perhaps that's not to our advantage. So I will eat what I call chicken stock to just to distinguish it from things like bone broth. And what I mean is I took my carcass because I don't waste anything. It's got a little bit of meat left on it. That's fine. I stick it in a pot of water. I add a bunch of good quality salt. I simmer it for, yeah, maybe half hour, 45 minutes because it's already cooked meat. I'm not worried about that. And then I'll drink that as a drink as well. And maybe I'll have a little bit of herbal tea. So regular day, my plants are very limited. Once, maybe twice a week, I might have a little bit of fruit, or honestly, I really like cabbage and I don't know why. So occasionally I'll have that. But that's it. Like otherwise I'm just eating meat. And what's intriguing to me is that okay, so I'm 63 and I have guns. And
Yeah, I can see that,
I'm
right.
like amazed by that because you're told, oh, you're an older woman, you're already through menopause, like you can't really build muscle. Well, son of a gun, turns out I can. So I'm happily bucking that particular trend.
Yeah, I definitely think that that is a myth, right? And that so much of it has to do with diet and definitely a lack of protein. And the muscle,
Think
the
about that.
skeletal muscle is so important, especially as we get older. And I always, I teach older women yoga and some Pilates. Most of my and men, most of my crew is 58 plus, and I try to stress the importance of at least increasing the protein.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's imperative.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you eat becomes your replacement parts. I don't think we think about that enough. Like people talk about cars and fuel, but your car doesn't have to rebuild its engine from the gas you put in. Like that doesn't happen, right? But me, we are rebuilding our body parts. We're remodeling them, we're refreshing them with what we eat. Who decided that a little hand-sized piece of protein was enough for a woman who's 5'4" and weighs about 140 pounds? I don't think that that's even reasonable, even if you just think about it, right? So yeah, if I'm going to have muscle, I better be doing something to build that. And that's protein. That's not, there's no carbs in there building those muscles. Yeah.
Yeah, and that it's almost unfair. We have to work harder, right? I'm 46. We have to
Yeah.
work harder. Like you can go and go to the gym 2 days a week in your 20s and stay buff and ripped, and you see the sculpted muscles, right? But once you hit what 35, we start to lose that bone and muscle more quickly than
But
we
here's
build it.
here's what I'd say about that. I only go to the club 2 times a week.
Okay, yeah. Well,
And I walk in between, but that's it. Because there is some research which is saying if your diet's correct and if you're doing the right kind of resistance training, you honestly don't need to be doing it every day. So I actually started out doing 2 times a week just because I thought I'm not going to make it too big a hurdle for me to jump. I'm just going to do it twice a week and that's going to be enough. And like persistently at 2 times a week, that's been enough. And so I think if you wanted faster results, but I was okay with taking my time to build the habit, to build the consistency. And again, it's this slow process. It's not necessarily the instant overnight process, which we tend to like better.
Yeah, that instant gratification, that quick fix, which is why I think so many people opt for that pill, right? This takes work and effort.
Sure.
Mhm. And it, and, to me, it's worth it, and important. Health has been, and a preventive type lifestyle has been important to me since I saw my mother undergo chemotherapy. It wasn't pretty at all, and I saw how sick she got. And, there would be weekends just because of the chemotherapy where, white counts were either high or whatever, right? And she had to go into the hospital and be completely isolated from us, for fear of risking infection or, further complications. And, at 12 years old, you have this fear of loss of your parent, right? It's not fun. I was like, there's no way this stuff has made her so sick. It's killed every good cell in her and bad cell in her body.
Yeah.
And that was just like pivotal for me, to and the journey has been, right. And I thought, as you thought, I was doing all the right things. They did.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They did, she did. It was finding this little Dutch woman in who had a juicery, and it might have helped, but she definitely were doing juicing and raw foods, lots of all the things, the spinach, the kale. And she's here. She'll be 70 this year. And that's not necessarily, she doesn't do that anymore. And maybe for a time it was helpful. I'm not sure. Maybe it was helpful in response to the chemotherapy.
I think in some cases, um, the toxicity of oxalate might work in your favor, although I would not necessarily willingly choose that at this point.
Right, me
But
either.
one of the chemotherapy drugs is platinum oxalate.
Mm,
And so, yeah, and we actually know that oxalate's toxic to the cell
mhm.
because of this platinum oxalate. Now, I think they probably assume the platinum's doing more of it, but I think that's a 2 for 1 when you've got that going on.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So, being 46 and you were 48, and I know we just have a few moments left, that you're going into perimenopause at that time. Like, I'm still having a regular menstrual cycle. It's starting to shift a little bit.
yeah.
And again, even that, I've been taking various online courses around, I'm not even sure I buy into. Of course, there's going to be cyclical changes for the woman, but I'm not buying into this, you know, menopause thing.
It's not the monster it's talked about, okay?
Right. And if
I
you're,
was
yeah, it's not. If you want it to be, you can make it your monster, right? And you
well,
can attach yourself to it. Oh, I've got terrible menopause, right? Part of it's a mindset, but a lot of it's lifestyle choices and food.
I think that food has a lot to do with it because by the time I hit menopause, so I was 54. At 54, I had been low oxalate for 6 years. I was pretty much through the worst of all of that, and, I don't remember having any of the things that people talked about. Would have mild, warm flushes, maybe, occasionally. And, but I didn't have any of the things that people were talking about. I didn't have mood dysregulation. I didn't have like, yeah, my body stopped cycling. That was clear. But what happened along with that was very minor. Like I'm quite serious. Mild, warmer flushes, maximum. I don't even know if I call it a flush. It would be like I'm a little warmer than I was a little while ago, and I'm not sure why, right? And now Like, I knew people who had menopause symptoms that went on for a decade or more. I certainly I had a year maybe where occasionally I'd wake up in the night because I was too warm, or occasionally I'd be too warm during the day, and that was really it. But I was physically fit. I wasn't eating a lot of oxalate, and it just passed like a very easy thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's my goal.
I
And
think it's doable. I think it's absolutely doable.
yeah, I mean, I feel confident, and I think part of it is a mindset, if that's what I, right, believe, and then, you know, making the changes necessary. Like my son was just in town. When he comes home, we don't see him. We go to all the favorite places, and I got to start all over, and I know I'm starting all over. and um, so um, anyway, tell me about your work, how people can find you, how you help them. Uh,
Yeah, more than happy to do that. Yeah. So there's multiple ways that you can find me, and some less expensive than others. So there's the no cost social media world. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. I have a page called Low Ox Coach. You can find me on Twitter where I'm Low Ox Coach 1, because I was originally Low Ox Coach on there and then somehow lost track of the email address that was linked to, and I can't get it back. So so you can find me on YouTube as Low Ox Coach as well. I work with a group of women who have all been at this low oxalate business for 16 years or more. We call ourselves the Wizards of Ox. You can find us on YouTube and on Facebook as well. We are all the senior admins to a support group called Trying Low Oxalates. And so that's on Facebook, but it's also on something called groupsio.io for those who are interested. I have a Patreon group where people can subscribe and get all kinds of helpful information about oxalate, about supplements, which may be helpful, about recipes and recipe hacks. You have multiple levels you can subscribe there, but if you subscribe at level 3, you get to sit in on a meeting with me once a month, and we talk all things oxalate, and people bring questions, and kind of an open mic format. And for those who are interested, I do have a website which I've been woefully ignoring, but it's lowoxcoach.com. There's a blog there which has got some information that people might find helpful, especially if they're first learning. And you can learn more about me, and you can also book an appointment if you decide that that's what you want to do. So we've got multiple ways you can find me. Um,
and
and
you do any one-on-one?
Yeah, I do both group coaching and one-on-one. I haven't run a group coaching recently, but the idea was to sort of say, okay, free stuff that everybody can find, then subscribe to Patreon, then group coaching, then one-on-ones. Because some people are going to be more than happy to kind of manage their own process, maybe with a little bit of hand holding, like group coaching. But for people who are having a really rough go, one-on-one can be great. And if you're just the kind of person who wants a bit more direction, then that can be an awesome option. So I do all of those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation, and that your Instagram, your social is definitely very inspiring. And I think it's helpful to have those reminders, and that help and support um, in a multitude of ways. It's definitely not easy to go it alone when everybody else is eating this other way. It's
Yeah,
hard
it's so different. Yeah, so you have to buck the trend, right?
to do. You
But
have to be ready to swim upstream.
and I definitely want people to know, at 48, I was sick enough, I thought I wouldn't live to see my kids grow up. Now I am currently building all these muscles so that I can get on the monkey bars with my grandchildren. So it
Absolutely.
can be it can be life changing, but it can be a rough initial start. So you have to kind of think of it like a parabolic curve, right? So if you need help in the early stages, that's really where I find I do most work with people, and I love it. I love, you know, being there and encouragement and bringing some enthusiasm to where they can get to.
Well, I know that's how we connect. We both wanna help people, take back their own health, and feel good, so,
Yeah. Yeah.
again, thanks so much, and be sure to check all of Monique's spots out. They will be listed in the, show notes. There were plenty of ways to find her and find her support, so, be sure to do that, and, have a great day.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You too.